Hey everybody, Adam from Passable Media. This is a completely unbidden and possibly unwanted addition to Nando V Movie's One Marvelous Scene project from just shy of a year ago. The project is very much a labour of love, identifying a scene that epitomises the Marvel Cinematic Universe for the creator in question. I've wanted to tackle this for ages, but all of my favourite scenes were already taken, and the last thing I wanted to do was double take somebody else's work. And now, a year later, I finally have my pick. Sam and Bucky's interaction with the police in episode 2 of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And let me tell you, this scene has layers on top of layers. I should probably take a moment to point out, as I have to do once in a while, that Passable Media is completely apolitical. While I'm actively talking about race and in particular racism in America in this one, this isn't a subject that defines the channel, and besides a few outliers, it isn't a thing we'd normally touch on very much at all. But it is absolutely integral to both the scene and this series as a whole.
Captures the African-American experience.
He's out of line, but he's right.
And I would be doing the show a disservice to not shine a bit of a light on it. I don't necessarily think that everyone will agree with my interpretation of the scene, but I hope that you'll give me a fair swing at it nonetheless. At time of writing and recording, 3 of the 6 episodes of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier are out, and by the time this is uploaded, we'll have seen the 4th. Besides the action and the intrigue expected from what is essentially a serialized sequel to Captain America the Winter Soldier, Malcolm Spellman is doing a tremendous job of tackling the subject of race in a measured and even-handed way, but more than that, he seems to be using it to tell us more about Sam, Bucky, and the relationship between the two of them. In episode 1, we saw Sam dealing with a bank manager that went from not being able to see him as anything more than a number on a spreadsheet to only seeing the Falcon, but never the man sitting in front of him, and an argument could be made that if Sam had played the situation better, the outcome may have been more in his favour, but that would be entirely missing the point. What that moment did for us is show that Sam hates when people see the symbol and not the man, and treat him differently because of it. One of the core themes that keeps popping up is that of symbols and the weight that they have. One other thing I do want to touch on in advance, and perhaps somewhere that the MCU has done a bit of a disservice to up to this point, bearing in mind that Steve Rogers was from the 40s, he had no visible reaction whatsoever to Nick Fury, one of the first people he encounters, and very much a black man, calling the shots at S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, of course, a conversation asking questions about this, or something like it, may have been played off screen and would certainly have been featured in whatever orientation Steve underwent before being loosed upon the world. Or we may just accept that Steve Rogers spawned from his mother's womb with a progressive 2010s-esque mentality towards the subject of race. The reason I bring this up at all is to compare and contrast this mindset to Bucky's shortly. We begin with Sam and Bucky arguing over the knowledge of Isaiah's existence and the splinter of the super soldier program that he was experimented on for. We can fairly conclusively say that part of the reason that Bucky kept this from Steve was that Steve would most definitely have had a problem with it, and it would have risked driving an even larger wedge between Captain America and the US government, something that was already hampering his attempts at heroing. And to be completely fair, it's not like the pair had very long together in the modern day as it was. Bucky was put on ice immediately after Civil War, and he didn't interact with Steve again until Infinity War, where he was promptly snapped. With the greatest respect, perhaps it simply wasn't in the forefront of Bucky's mind, given everything else that always seemed to be going on. Still, this seems to be something that has weighed on Bucky's mind, and Sam is quite rightly pretty angry about being kept in the dark as having not been the first black superhero, and not out of ego, but simply as a matter of representation and recognition. Why has Isaiah been allowed to fade into obscurity, and why were the people who ruined his life not held accountable for their actions? Now, perhaps unfairly, Sam sees this as Bucky keeping this cycle going and not having done anything to help resolve the issue. Before we can get any deeper into it, the scene concludes with the arrival of the police. They, of course, did not see the Falcon and the Winter Soldier having a loud and frank discussion about illegal government experiments. No. They see a white guy in what appears to be a predominantly black neighbourhood getting yelled at by a black guy in the street. They see a potentially dangerous altercation, and they jump into action, circling Sam and giving him no clear line of escape, hands on their weapons and asking to see identification. Sam, seemingly on reflex, tells them he doesn't have ID. Interestingly, Jade originally took this scene to mean that because of getting blipped, he literally didn't have a valid form of ID, but given his work for the US government, I find this to be spurious at best. I'd say that it in fact makes it clear to us, and should do to Bucky, that he doesn't want to be identified as Sam Wilson, the Falcon. Throughout this segment, the gears are turning in Sam's head, and he's clearly clearly aggravated in his compounded situation. He's angry that Isaiah was kept from him, from the world. He's angry that this is the first he's hearing about it, and he's most definitely angry that the police have just rolled up and started treating him like a perp. The officer tells Sam to calm down, and Sam insists that he is, in fact, calm, and asks what they want. Then Bucky cuts in and tells Sam to give the officer his ID, which, again, he most definitely does have. This honestly surprises me a little bit, because while Bucky, like Steve, grew up in the early 20th century, he also spent about 2 years in Wakanda, and would have had something of a crash course of his own in what was happening here. Indeed, it's pretty clear from the rest of his reactions during the conversation that he wasn't completely oblivious and was actively trying to de-escalate. I have a theory that it has more to do with his time in the military and to a lesser but still significant degree with his time in Hydra. There's an appeal to authority thing going on here, and he feels the need to justify the two of them to the police. Maybe it's just that while they're certainly colleagues, Sam and Bucky are not friends at this point, more like friends of a friend, and Bucky might not have a handle on Sam's way of thinking. Regardless, this visibly confuses the officer, because all of a sudden this is starting to look a lot less like what he thought it was. Maybe he made a mistake. But he motions away Sam's protest and asks Bucky whether Sam is bothering him, hands still on his gun all the while. This time Bucky makes it clear that Sam isn't bothering him, and he starts to get hot under the collar himself. Maybe this is where things started to fall into place in his mind as to what's going on, but he goes completely the wrong way about de-escalating, asking, "Do you know who this is?" Now this for me is further proof that Bucky does not get Sam at all, and the look on Sam's face says it all. He knows right away how this is going to go down, and this isn't at all what he wanted. The officer's partner darts over and clears up exactly who Sam is right away, and immediately the officer stumbles over himself to apologise, exclaiming, "Oh God," and making excuses that he didn't recognise him without the costume. Right at that moment, it doesn't matter whether Sam did or didn't do anything wrong. Bucky had played his get out of jail free card on his behalf, and he's rightly pissed. As the officer is called back to his car, the residents are looking on, and what might they be thinking then? Maybe, why does no interaction I have with the cops go like that? Or why does it matter who he is? At a basic level, confusion about what's going on. You can feel the tension in the air as their eyes are boring holes into him. Bucky, seeming for a moment that he was going to apologise for playing the Falcon card, instead goes back to their discussion about Isaiah and attempts to justify not having mentioned him before now. So we're back to oblivious. Sam's clearly not placated, but before there can be any kind of resolution, the officers return. In stark contrast to the original interaction, and bear in mind that Bucky is a well-known serial killer, super soldier, and very much a threat to the officers, the police are here to arrest Bucky for missing his therapy session, apologising all the way and explaining the situation and the nature of the warrant between Mr. Barnes's and no hands on their weapons, nothing. And the utter absurdity of handcuffing someone that you know can break out of them by sneezing too hard, it's all for show. One of the officers even holds out his hand to make sure that Bucky doesn't bump his head getting into the car. And what's the difference here between Sam and Bucky clearly being highlighted that very much isn't the fact that one of them is an enhanced killing machine with a vibranium arm, while the other is a man with a flight suit, sans flight suit? Yeah, Mr. Barnes is white. The stark difference in their treatment and the Isaiah realisation lines Sam's face as the car drives away. He takes a long look back at Isaiah's home and he leaves for the police station, all but forgotten. What I love about this scene is that none of the subtext needs to be blurted out. There's no additional exposition needed. Nobody is saying we're treating you like this because you're black or because you're white, but the intention is clear as day. Unlike, say, the CW's Arrowverse shows, which can and often do come across as simultaneously heavy-handed and hollow when they address similar issues, and find the need to talk down to the audience that they're loudly preaching to. I find that the best way of comparing the two is that a lot of media talks at you with this sort of thing, whereas I very much feel like we're in this scene with the characters being guided through it. This scene makes it clear that in regards to racial politics, the world of the Marvel Cinematic Universe isn't so different from our own, at least in terms of America. We also have a tacit explanation as to why this has never been addressed in-universe before, because the heroes, the lens through which we see the MCU, seem to be put on a pedestal above it all, and not because of who they are, but because of what they are. And this works in two ways, because you could absolutely stop the race conversation at the moment that Sam is revealed to be the Falcon, since by the point that Bucky is arrested, they also knew that he was the Winter Soldier. That is, of course, if he weren't treated completely differently right from the outset. Bucky went from a victim to a hero to a reluctant arrest, while Sam fell completely from the officer's notice the moment he was identified, and a quick escape could be made. The officer wasn't apologising for inconveniencing Sam Wilson, the black man. He was apologising for bothering the Falcon. And that's the scene. Do I think that this is a universally appreciable interaction between the police and a pair of civilians? No, I think not. not. But do I think that it's both a fair and reasonable portrayal of comparable interactions and meanwhile a noteworthy take on the black experience and its relation to police in the US? Absolutely. But I also don't think it has to be taken that way. While it's certainly meant to mirror real-world interactions, this is fiction. What this scene actually does is very clearly continue to set up Sam's arc, both in terms of coming to terms with his place in the MCU, as Sam Wilson and as the Falcon, and where the distinction between the two truly lies, while also shining a light on Bucky's tendency towards kowtowing to authority and taking the easier route out of conflict. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into my choice for One Marvelous Scene. Although I have no doubt that if you're watching this, you're already familiar with the original wave of videos from this project, but just in case, I've left a link in the description to the playlist by Nando V Movies. And with all that said, I've been Adam from Passable Media. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with all your friends. And also your enemies. Basically anyone and everyone.